votre costume de tirailleur alors que vous allez être démobilisé d'ici. Et pourquoi vous n'avez pas pris la nationalité française? Vous êtes instruit, non?
La nationalité française.
Okay, and I'll start talking. Okay, I think we finally figured out our 6,000 different tech issues. I'm just here to welcome you. Chad Kautzer will be introducing this panel, but I just want to say thanks to you all for coming. Happy to see all of you here. And I'm Julie Carr of the English Department and Chair of Women and Gender Studies, and I'm one of the founding board members of the April Institute, which you'll hear a little bit more about from Chad. So I just also want to thank the English Department, the Department of History and of Geography for support, for financial support, and the Center for Humanities and Arts and the President's Fund for the Humanities. So we've had 4 events this year. This is our last one for the year, and these different units supported us in those 4. So thanks to them for that. So Chad Kautzer will, as I said, introduce this today's panel. Chad Kautzer is a professor of philosophy at Lehigh University. He's the author of Radical Philosophy, a fantastic book out with Routledge, and he is also one of the founding board members of the April Institute for Anti-Fascist Research and Education, and is my very good friend, and I welcome him to stand up.
Thank you very much, Julie. Thanks for everyone for coming. Thanks for the tech people for helping us set up the live stream. Greetings to, looking at the camera back there, those joining us remotely. We really appreciate it. If you hear children during this event, those are my children. They have joined us too. Let me first thank Julie Carr, the amazing Julie Carr. She's incredible, and she made this event possible. And this is the fourth event that we've organized here and that Julie has spearheaded on Boulder's campus or with Boulder people, because 2 of them were online. Great events, and we really appreciate all the work that she's done. Julie is an inspirational poet, writer, errant. She's an author and a builder of worlds in word and deed. She's a pragmatic organizer of people, a creator of spaces and platforms that allow for new possibilities and constellations to emerge. And although the threats that we face today can be overwhelming if you really let yourself feel them, as Julie does, she keeps pushing through and holds the ground and keeps building through it all. And for that, we deeply appreciate her and all the work that she does. Actually, next month, we're going to be hosting Julie in New York for a talk through the April Institute. It's going to be about her forthcoming book, Mud, Blood and Ghosts, Populism, Eugenics, and Spiritualism in the American West. And we're also going to be shooting a short documentary film about Julie and this book. And it's going to include some sites in New York that are relevant to the history of eugenics and proto-fascist thinking. We're very excited about that. The April Institute, which is a sponsor of this event tonight, is a research and education nonprofit. It's based in New York. Our goal is to tell the stories of the history of anti-fascist resistance, make people aware of the history of fascist movements and tendencies in the US, and to build resources for people to use to learn about those, to be inspired by the anti-fascist histories, and to make those changes that need to be made today. We're building digital exhibitions, teaching resources. We're working on publications, a pamphlet series. We're very excited. I'm getting a little ahead of myself, but our first speaker is also with the April Institute, Anna, and she's going to launch a podcast very soon on fascism and anti-fascism in America. And we're very, very excited about that. So I encourage you, if you're interested in checking out what we've done so far, if you're interested in getting involved with us to do things in the future, check out our website, aprilinstitute.org. reach out to any of the speakers, reach out to Julie, reach out to myself. Okay. Oh, and I should say, I mentioned that we're building digital exhibitions. One of the first exhibitions we're going to develop is on the Hands Off Ethiopia campaign, which is the topic of today's discussion. We're very excited. We're going to rely on the work of the speakers here today, their expertise. And so look for that in the future as well. Okay, with that, let me start introducing the speakers in the order that they'll be presenting today. So Anna Dunsing is a historian and postdoctoral fellow at the Carter G. Woodson Institute for African American and Africana Studies at the University of Virginia. She received her PhD in history and African American studies from Yale University in 2022. Anna is a historian of the US and the world, specializing in transnational African American history, Black radicalism, and the evolving global politics of white supremacy and right-wing extremism across the 20th century. She is currently working on her first book manuscript, tentatively entitled Fascism is Already Here, Civil Rights and the Making of a Black Anti-Fascist Tradition. In addition to her scholarship, Anna has a deep commitment to public humanities, work that includes researching and teaching immigration history at the Lower East Side Tenement Museum in New York. Fantastic place. If you haven't been there, I recommend you go. Mining histories of gun violence and the origins of the National Rifle Association with a moving image artist at the Park Avenue Armory in New York. And more recently, helping to develop anti-fascist education programs through the April Institute. And as I mentioned, she'll be developing this podcast very soon. Joseph Franzak is our second presenter. He's an associate research scholar in the history department at Princeton University. His book, Everything is Possible, Anti-Fascism and the Left in the Age of Fascism, was just released by Yale University Press. It's still warm, and I'm making my way through it, and it's brilliant. It explains how anti-fascism became a global political cause in the mid-1930s and explores how the anti-fascist left of these years helped shape today's political world. Very much a concern that we have. So his article, Local People's Global Politics, A Transnational History of the Hands-Off Ethiopia Movement of 1935, was selected by Oxford University Press for its 2016 must-read foreign relations history list. Minka Makalani is our third speaker. He's an associate professor of history and director of the Center for Africana Studies at Johns Hopkins University. His first book, In the Cause of Freedom, Radical Black Internationalism from Harlem to London, 1917 to 1939, also brilliant. I recommend it to everyone. Explores how early 20th century Caribbean radicals in Harlem and London drew on their experiences with racism, colonial domination, and political organizing to forge a Black internationalist politics that engaged with Marxism, but pushed beyond its organizational and theoretical parameters. He is currently working on two book projects, one about C.L.R. James and his return to Trinidad, and the other a collection of essays on how diverse modes of Black intellectual production offer the possibility of moving beyond established theoretical frames and practices. Okay, one word about format before I turn it over to Anna, who will be our first speaker, and she's joining us remotely. We thought each of us, or each of the presenters, those in person would come up to the podium and speak for 5 to 10 minutes. And after all the presenters are finished, we are encouraging them to have a discussion amongst themselves for 15 plus minutes, ask each other questions, make connections between presentations, and then we'll open it up for Q&A to the general audience, okay? And with that, I want to welcome Anna Dunsing. Are you there? Yes. Welcome, Anna.
Hello. Can you all hear me? Yes, amazing. Okay, cool. Well, thank you. Thank you so much for being here. It was not my first choice to be zooming in this sort of big brother-like fashion. But I have learned my lesson for the second time now about traveling multi-leg journeys out of a regional airport in Central Virginia on a windy day. So before I go into my comments, I want to also offer my gratitude to Julie Carr and everyone else on the ground who made this event possible, and I'm also grateful to my fellow co-organizers at the April Institute. And I do really also want to say I'm so excited to be in conversation with Minka Makalani and Joe Franchek. I do mean it when I say both of your books are literally on my desk. You've got Joe's here, and Dr. Makalani, yours is at my office. But I just because both of their sort of their body of scholarship has been indispensable to me in developing my own work, and this really feels, yeah, I'm so excited. So I thought, as a way to open up the conversation and knowing a little bit about what my co-presenters are going to speak to at the start, that I would open with two unifying ideas that really drive my research, which in turn shape my perspective, both as a historian thinking about the past, as well as an activist, deeply committed to naming and organizing against the fascist threat in the present. And so the first organizing idea, the first motivation for my work is about the Black anti-fascist tradition, right? Which is in my work, right, as a scholar, as a historian of the United States, I approach that as a Black radical internationalist political tradition rooted in the United States, though there are many other iterations around the world across many different eras. But I approach the Black anti-fascist tradition essentially as a sensitive, highly influential, always evolving, and deeply multifaceted political phenomenon that spans the 20th century and courses up into our present moment. We can track it in the form of Black radical thought, grassroots organizing, armed self-defense, mutual aid, solidarity building, and other diverse efforts to dismantle the racist and capitalist white world order and to dream and build the world anew. And for me, a focus on a Black anti-fascist tradition invites us to think about anti-fascism as one thread among many, anti-fascism as a unifying force, as something bound up with anti-racist, anti-capitalist, and anti-colonial struggle. And I think most important in this conversation, especially to think about an anti-fascist perspective, both in theory and practice, that is committed to formulating fascism beyond the geographic and temporal bounds of interwar Europe. So that's the kind of first unifying idea. The second one really follows that, which says, by taking Black anti-fascist politics seriously, by studying it closely in all its richness, in its many manifestations, really dating back the past 100 years from this present moment, we open up an abundance of really studied and sophisticated and deeply serious answers to the question of fascism in the United States, past and present. And for me, we really open ourselves up to a rich archive of people who have been engaged in the question of what does fascism look like in the United States after 1945, especially, right? Seeing it as this many-headed hydra, not just, I think what people might expect, which is the armed and uniformed rabble-rouser, but also as a kind of low hum in its more incipient and lying in wait forms. So with those two establishing ideas in mind, I thought, in setting up this conversation, we're going to be thinking about Black anti-fascist politics writ large, thinking about them in this first swelling global crescendo in the form of the hands-off Ethiopia movement, which Joe has written about so beautifully in his new book. But I do think over the course of this conversation, we're going to be moving in long arcs. We're going to be putting the past in conversation with the present and, thinking about what our study of the past can do for us in confronting the present crisis. And I thought, and my portion just to start would be to look at kind of the earliest murmurings of a Black anti-fascist tradition, what I, not necessarily looking strictly to Black radical intellectuals or strictly to, grassroots street clashes, but thinking about something that I in my work have often thought about as a kind of common sense anti-fascism in the Black public sphere in the interwar United States. And I want to start there and give you a little bit of background there, because when I was just starting out in my research, two things that really stood out to me in tapping into the discourse about sort of the fascism debates is that it was really frustrating to me that many scholars and pundits in the no camp, either with regard to the past or more contemporary movements, they were making claims about past attitudes or past political situations in the United States, but it really seemed to me that none of them had taken up a Black newspaper from the 1920s or 1930s or 40s, and they weren't engaging with Black radical intellectuals and scholars of the Black radical tradition. And similarly, years ago, reading books that were tracking how Americans responded to the rise of fascism, as in fascist movements in Europe, and what kind of public responses were, in those footnotes, I wasn't seeing Black newspapers or Black poets and scholars and public figures, journalists in those footnotes. So even just a cursory look at those archives really revealed that there were very different conversations happening in the Black public sphere about fascism, both abroad and at home in the interwar period. And I think more importantly, very different attitudes and very different conversations about what was to be done about the fascist threat, both abroad at home, what the nature of that threat was, and how communities could come together in multiracial coalition to organize against them. So I will say in my research coverage of the earliest years of Mussolini's fascist regime in Italy and the kind of fascist street fighting and early murmurings in Weimar Germany, coverage in the Black press was intermittent in the early years in the 1920s, but it was there and it was watchful. But what is really clear is that the journalists and intellectuals writing in Black newspapers in the United States really from the beginning were deeply aware of a grammar of race and nation undergirding fascism. And you see even in the weeks before Mussolini's march on Rome in 1922 that Black newspapers are comparing his movement to the Ku Klux Klan in the United States. And to give you a few more examples, more specific ones, in 1927, there's a Jamaican-American journalist and scholar named J.A. Rogers who's writing in the Baltimore Afro-American. And let me pull up the quote. So he's writing in the newspaper about, he's reflecting on Reconstruction, the tumult and the violence and the kind of erosion of democracy characteristic of the Reconstruction years in the United States. But he's writing about that as his last report out of Milan as a foreign correspondent. And he notes what his sources are telling him. So he's hearing in Italy mounting accounts of assassinations, whippings, maiming, the invasion of homes, mass arrests, the raiding and burning of newspaper offices. And he writes, "No newspaper is permitted to print any hostile opinion. Labor is not permitted to go on strike. The death sentence has been revived. Jazz is not permitted." And the paper ran his article under the headline, "Fascism Like Ku Klux." And then the following year, another journalist also covering news from Italy says, Il Duce joins the Klan. And this is a quote that I think is really key here. The journalist wrote, "Like a true Klansman, he thinks that this earth belongs to the white race and is shocked at the presumption of those of darker hue that they have a future in the world." And I think that quote is so key because, right, all these references to the Klan, right, the Klan looming large, the Klan of the 1920s, this robust, massive, sprawling, oftentimes very elite, while also populist organization, right, very representative of mainstream American attitudes in the 1920s, very represented, many people in power, lawmakers, judges, police in the Klan, right? The Klan is the main point of the comparison often, right? And in some respects, we can think of the Klan as something ostensibly unique to the American political landscape. And yet this moment, right, he thinks the earth belongs to the white race and is shocked at the presumption of those of darker hue that they have a future in the world, right? So reference to this maybe uniquely American thing, but this writer is also thinking about the world, right? Also thinking about the way white power politics course through the earth, the way the violence of the Klan is related to, deeper histories of European and Euro-American racial colonial violence, right? And that's all just contained within a few lines in a small, foreign affairs column. Just a few more quotes to sort of bring us up to the 1930s then. The Baltimore Afro-American in 1930, covering the major gains that the Nazi Party had in federal elections in Germany. And they warned that, quote, Germany's Ku Klux Klan was now the second strongest political party in the country. And the article offered this really bleak analysis of what that meant for Germany, for the world, and specifically also for the Black diaspora, and observed to its readers that they should look at the world situation facing their Jewish neighbors and tighten their belts for the long struggle ahead. And then, moving forward, 1932, Adolf Hitler has a failed presidential bid, and the Chicago Defender observed, that they observed this growing power, right, and says that the Nazi Party surely studied the same book as the Klan, just going under a different name. And they actually declared Hitler to be, quote, the Vardaman of Europe. And they define that as someone who's against everything Jewish and Black. And that is a reference to former Mississippi Governor and Senator James K. Vardaman, who in his reign once vowed to lynch every Black resident of his state if it would be in the service of preserving white supremacy. And then finally, in March 1933, as Hitler is rapidly consolidating his power, you see the same analogies unfold. In this case, right, a Black scholar and columnist named Kelly Miller notes that the Klan model, again, is being used in Germany, which he defined as appeal to patriotism reinforced by the dynamics of hate. And he also argues that, right, what's happened is that Hitler started as this fringe rabble rouser, but is now achieving dictatorial power. And he says essentially, like countless Klan leaders, his platform appeals to everyday Germans, even if he himself packages his ideas in fanatical passion and pageantry. And the last quote I'll leave you with before I'll show you a few political cartoons from this era. For Miller, right, Miller and other students of what's happening abroad, other major voices in the Black press, continue again to this grammar of race and nation as what's the connective tissue between what's happening in a place like Germany or Italy and what's happening in the United States. And Miller concludes, the sinister insurgence of race passion is exemplified in the Hitler movement should cause minorities in all parts of the globe to indulge in some long distance thinking. And just because the visual archive of this era is also so rich, I will briefly show you some political cartoons from these same newspapers across the same era. So first April 1933, just a few months after Hitler's come to power and is rapidly consolidating his power, and you see him depicted as another Klansman. And then I think also increasingly, in addition to the image of the Klansman, the Black press also really takes up other sometimes specific and sometimes abstracted images of sort of law and order, whether it is the police, the Jim Crow judge, the sheriff, what have you. And I think more to worry about is also key, right? That this isn't necessarily a sort of distinct movement. The rise of fascism signifies a kind of mounting problem within the threats already apparent within the Jim Crow United States. And then just as a way to transition to Joe's comments, two more panels that ran in the New York Amsterdam News in 1935. On the right is, I won't get too into this one, but this is from a noted Black radical political cartoonist named Ollie Harrington, who's making a jab at white communist organizers coming up to Harlem. But on the left, you'll see the headline, right? Italy, Ethiopia war, clouds loom. And the woman reading observes, right, at least it's clear why Italy insists on going to war with Ethiopia. Mussolini is still angry because Joe Louis beat Primo Carnera. a noted Black American boxer, noted Italian boxer, in a fight that I believe happened in New York, if I remember correctly. But this is a framework I'll sort of pass on to Joe then, right? That the local and the global are really converging within just one small panel in one issue of one newspaper. And with that, I think I'd love to turn it over to Joe to get us into the emergence and specifics of the movement itself. Thank you all so much.
One thing. Go ahead.
All right, so thank you, like everyone else has said, thank you to Julie, Chad, Jenny, Holly, everyone who has put in all the work to make this happen and to make the April Institute this lantern shining its light, shining a way forward. All right, so with these initial comments here, I decided I should just lay out a pretty basic sense of the historic nuts and bolts of Hands Off Ethiopia. I'm a social historian at heart, and so I think specifics really are the place to ground ourselves and to launch from there, to build from. Anna's speech already brought us around up to Hands Off Ethiopia, and then from what I understand, Menkos is going to have us launch from it. So this is almost like I'm going to give you like the internal history of Hands Off Ethiopia. This is also, I think, they're asking us to dream with our eyes open and to with our eyes open, what nightmares we see. I'm giving us something much more simple. I think of this as I'm giving you basically like the bass solo here in the song, which I know is everybody's favorite part of a song. But so just think of this as the bass solo, and I'll turn it over to, I guess, Minka, that makes you the saxophonist, I thought so. There we go. All right, so at the end of 1934, there was a skirmish between Ethiopian and Italian forces at an oasis called Wall. Benito Mussolini, the fascist dictator of Italy, used this as a pretext to begin mobilizing for war. He wanted to invade, colonize Ethiopia, an independent African nation. And so then many months later, for all this talk about Mussolini getting the trains run on time, he didn't actually do anything all that competently, but nonetheless, by October 1935, fascist Italy had invaded Ethiopia, begun a war, and pretty soon begun a brutal occupation. So Hands Off Ethiopia, the movement went on after October 1935, but the movement, by the time that the war began, the movement was already very much a global thing. People were already mobilizing throughout 1935 on a really epic scale. Anti-fascists, and I think you could say anti-fascists in the making, were all agitating, organizing local protests all over the world. Like I said, everywhere from Johannesburg to Calcutta, everywhere from Tokyo to Cairo, from Montreal to Buenos Aires, people were protesting. And then, yes, in the United States, in particular in the Black neighborhoods of the big cities, people were protesting against this very clear march to war. So I hope we have time to kind of bring back some more discussion as we go forward about some of these local movements that made the Hands Off Ethiopia movement. In particular, I'm interested in the Harlem movement. And then also, even thinking beyond the United States, I think it's useful to remember, like Anna said, that this is a global movement that was very much interconnected. Minka, you've written about the London scene, which included a speaker from the United States, fascinating mass protest in Trafalgar Square in August of 1935. But what I want to do right now is I just want to focus on, give you the sense of one local movement. I want to talk about the movement in Chicago rooted in the Black neighborhoods on the south side of Chicago. So what I want to do is I want to impress 4 things about this movement. First, just how quickly, how directly protest produced voice. Didn't win, it didn't prevent the war, it didn't create structural change quickly, but I want to impress upon you that protest puts one's voice out there, again, very quickly, very directly. Secondly, I want to say the Chicago movement shows how important it is to adapt your methods of protest to your surroundings, to the built environment around you, to have a sense of place about your protest, to think about how your protest fits within your given ecology. And then the third thing that I want to impress, the third thing that I think that the Chicago movement shows is simply how inspiring protest is. And in particular, I'm thinking of for its participants. The Hands Off Ethiopia protests in Chicago in 1935, I think, in very clear ways changed the direction of the lives of some of those who took part. That's something that protest does. And then the fourth and final thing that I think the Chicago scene shows very clearly is how central the role of the police is in shaping protest, certainly in the modern United States, but I think this is a general rule. So, okay, so first we start early 1935. I want to emphasize a small group of anti-fascists, or again, anti-fascists in the making, centered in the Black neighborhoods of Chicago on the south side, who at least want to make it known that their thought is Benito Mussolini ought to lay his hands off Ethiopia. And so they figure out, what are they going to do? How are they going to make that known? And so they start figuring out how they're going to organize a movement, how they're going to protest. And they come up with their first demonstration, I think is a real a beauty, a wonder of protest. They decide, what are they going to do? They are far away from the border between the Italian colony of Somalia and the border of Ethiopia, where this conflict is taking form. They're on the other side of the world. What can they do? So they staged their protest at the Italian consul there in Chicago. They picked the right spot. And then the second thing they do is they understand that protest is theater. They come up with this wonderfully theatrical protest. The heart of the protest is 2 women among this small group, a white woman from the west side named Lillian Rabin and a Black woman from the south side of Chicago named Eloise Robinson. They set up out front of the consul and they handcuff themselves and with a chain lock themselves to a lamppost in front of the consul, and they have on big, baggy, huge white sweatshirts that say "Hands Off Ethiopia." And then, of course, as you would guess, they very quickly begin to draw a crowd. And anytime you draw a crowd in Chicago in 1935, you're also going to draw the police. And the police are very frustrated to find that they cannot haul them off to jail because, as I said, they've locked themselves to the lamppost. The confounding of the police is part of what is so joyful about the scene, what draws the crowd. And this is downtown in the Loop of Chicago. Does anyone know what makes downtown Chicago the Loop? What is the Loop? The L, yeah, exactly. So you have an elevated train. So they are right below an elevated train station. So some of their comrades make their way up the stairs to the L station, and they drop leaflets, anti-war leaflets on this gathered crowd. So they have done the work of gathering a crowd, and now they're getting their message out in leaflets. It's quite a joyful scene. The police are confounded, and they are trying to clear the crowd. And during all this carnival scene, some of their other comrades slip their way into the consul and make their thoughts known to the Italian fascist officials there in person. This is something that they were not supposed to be allowed to do. So this was a wonderfully effective first act to the Chicago protest scene. The second act, I think I'll try to say very briefly, they think about how to make their voice known to, all the respectable people. Where are all the respectable people in Chicago? They're on Michigan Avenue shopping. And so on the weekends, all of a sudden, among the crowds of people shopping, all of a sudden there's this, what one of the organizers later called flash actions. These sudden marches that pop out of nowhere. All of a sudden, among the throngs of shoppers, there are people chanting and singing and holding up signs. Doesn't take long, again, recurring theme, doesn't take long for the Chicago police to show up. And so what happens? People drop their signs and the march disappears just like that. Another clever, creative way of protesting. And here you see, again, like as if it were a film negative, you see the weight of the police on the protest. They had to figure out how to make this a flash action and then drop back into the crowds, and they're protected by the crowds. And you also, think back again here to why there were those handcuffs in the last demonstration, because they knew that as soon as they peaceably assembled, the police would try very hard to take them and haul them off to jail. Okay, so then the last thing I'll say is just the biggest protest of Chicago during 1935. Later on in the summer, as it becomes more and more clear that this war is going to happen, they want to have a mass march. The city authorities say no permit. And so they gather at a settlement house for a late Friday night meeting, and they discuss what to do. And they vote on whether to hold the parade anyway, even without permission. And the vote's unanimous. They hold their demonstration. It's going to be a mass march down 47th Street. This is in the back of the yards. This is the heart of Black Chicago, on the south side of Chicago. And so they decide they're going to hold their mass march, and they know the police will be waiting for them. The police were waiting for them. And so they came up with different ways to deal with that. Once again, they used the size of the crowd to their advantage. Rather than have one person give a speech at any one point, all of a sudden amongst the crowd, someone would pop up and start a speech. The police would move in and try and grab that person and haul them off. And so then someone else would pick up the speech somewhere else. And so it was this, according to what people said who were there, it was this beautiful thing, this collective act of speech. It had its own sort of wonderment to it. But then for longer speeches, so what did they decide that they wanted to do? They figured out along the marching route to have rooftop oratory. And so they set up different points along the march route where they would have people giving speeches from the rooftops. And nobody seems to have recorded very well what people said from the rooftops. What stuck with people was just that simple physical act of speaking freely. And then eventually the police would make their way up to the rooftops and haul them off. And then someone else down the street would show up on a different rooftop and give a speech. So, there were, I don't know how many rooftop speeches there were several. I know two of them. One was a man named Oliver Law, and another one was a man named Harry Haywood. And one thing that I just want to flag about the both of them is this is 1935. And so the Hands Off Ethiopia movement didn't stop the war in Ethiopia from happening. And they didn't even, one thing that they thought about trying to do was organize volunteer militias to go fight against the fascists in Ethiopia. And they didn't pull that off. But it was a dry run for the big fascist offensive in 1936. What was the big move by the fascists of the world in 1936? What's the big historic? Spain. And those two rooftop orators, Oliver Law and Harry Haywood, they took a steamer across the ocean and they fought against fascism in Spain, the both of them. So again, didn't prevent the invasion, but what a statement of solidarity these anti-fascists made on the south side of Chicago in 1935. They certainly showed voice. What a forceful statement, in part because, as I've tried to say, They paid attention to their built environment. They adapted their protest to their surroundings. They paid very careful attention to the sense of place, whether it be the rooftops of 47th Street or the L station above the Italian consul down in the Loop on Wells Street. And then, third, like I said, yes, from these quick little impressionistic stories that I've told, you see the weight of the police in shaping protest. And two things to take from that. Yeah, the police are going to show up and try to stop that protest, but also notice how people played with that. And they made that part of the theater of their protest. Part of what was so inspiring about those rooftop speeches was that the police couldn't get them right away. And what joy people took from seeing that physical liberty, as I said. And then fourth, I said, how inspiring protests can be even for participants. And I think the likes of Rabin and Robinson, of Law and Haywood, and what an influence this had on their lives. Like I said, at least two of them ended up in Spain only months later. And I guess at that point, I'll turn it over to Minka.
Do I need to share the screen? I need to share the screen. Share the phones. Let me just make sure. Yeah, the bottom left. Sorry, before you share. Okay. So I'm going to make this far more complicated on myself than I need to, and try and show a couple of slides and then a brief video clip. But I want to thank Chad, Julie for the invitation, Holly for the work and being patient with me in terms of travel, and everyone else who's made this possible. When I got the invitation, I was very excited to come and participate in this. I also knew other people who were participating in the previous meetings, some of whom I've known for a long time, some of whom I've admired for even longer. And then over the past year, I've kind of felt that we need to bring some other kinds of elements into this discussion. So I want to start with the woman in the middle of the frame here. And this is October 6, 1969. This is 25-year-old Angela Davis, and she's entering the UCLA, it's Royce Hall, University of California's Royce Hall, to deliver her first lectures as an acting assistant professor in philosophy. And I'll just say that when I went to give my first lecture almost 20 years ago, I was nervous as hell with 8 students. Over 1,500 students, faculty, and activists packed Royce Hall to hear her lecture. They did so because the previous summer, after she had been appointed as an acting assistant professor, the Board of Regents, under the direction of Governor Ronald Reagan, fired her because she was a member of the Communist Party. Angela Davis had been a member of the Communist Party. She was a member of the Black Panther Party. She was a part of the all-Black communist formation, the Che Lumumba Club, and was unabashed in her political affiliations. Ultimately, she sued, and the Superior Court of California ruled that she could not be barred from teaching because she was a communist. However, Reagan, ever persistent, appointed an investigating committee that would investigate a series of off-campus statements that Angela Davis had made over the course of that year. And while they found that she had not been indoctrinating her students, that her quote unquote inflammatory rhetoric off campus were grounds for her dismissal. Now, listen to Reagan explaining what happened. Quote, "It was based wholly on the questions that were brought up at the ad hoc faculty committee with regard to her remarks and her conduct in speaking around the various campuses. And it was believed that this displayed an unprofessional conduct. And it was on this basis that the regents voted that she not be rehired." A very legitimate, reasoned process of the state. I'm sure they would have explained. What was Davis's inflammatory rhetoric? The committee identified as, quote, particularly offensive such utterances as her statement that the Board of Regents, quote, killed, brutalized, and murdered the People's Park demonstrators, and her repeated characterization of the police as, quote unquote, pigs. And for good measure, the committee also noted that Davis was, quote, less than fair in her characterizations of the views of fellow scholars with whom she disagreed. Now, again, this is because they can't fire her for being a communist. But Angela Davis was talking about Reagan's actions in what is known as Bloody Thursday, the May 15, 1969 decision by Reagan to send state troopers and police into Berkeley's People's Park. And Reagan had long complained about the UC campus as being a hotbed of radicalism, but he put the entire city for a little over 2 weeks under martial law, using tear gas spraying helicopters. The riot police killed one protester, maimed another, and blinded him actually with buckshot, and arrested hundreds. Even at one point, when one protest happened along a main thoroughfare, not only getting the protesters, the people who ran businesses, pulling them out of their businesses and arresting them. So this was the nature of what she was talking about when she identified, if we are to believe this committee, that the Regents had killed, brutalized, and murdered the People's Park protesters. So her firing, I want to suggest, though, is not simply about her inflammatory rhetoric. This was politically convenient for Reagan, but a more fundamental concern was what Davis was teaching. Now listen to this quote from Angela Davis. We have to talk about a complete and total change to the structure of this society, because that's the only way that a concept like academic freedom is going to be made relevant. We have to go to the streets. Davis posed both a political, but perhaps more importantly, an epistemological threat to the dominant order. Consider that her first lecture at Royce Hall, where Davis made clear her view that, quote, education should not mold the mind according to a prefabricated architectural plan. It should rather liberate the mind and create human beings who possess a genuine concern for their fellow human beings. The topic of those lectures, which have been published as lectures on liberation and can be found online, focused on a conception of freedom that was drawn from Black literature. Davis argued that while freedom had dominated the history of Western ideas, quote, Black literature provides a much more illuminating account of the nature of freedom, its extent and limits, than all the philosophical discourses on this theme in the history of Western society. So rather than follow normative approaches found in philosophy or political theory, Davis turned to Black literature because, quote, it projects the consciousness of a people who had been denied entrance into the real world of freedom. Black people have exposed by their very existence the inadequacies not only of a practice of freedom, but of its very theoretical formulation. So I begin with this because I want to bring into view the long history of fascism in the United States, which has developed a repertoire of policies, modes of governance, and state practices that are too often sequestered from discussions of fascism in Europe. Consider then that Reagan's charges against Davis follow a long line of arguments about the nature of academic freedom that seeks to limit knowledge production to what is considered legitimate and legitimates the West as a civilizationist project. It is this much longer project that we see today culminating in attacks on critical race theory, and most dynamically in Ron DeSantis's attacks on Black studies, women and gender studies. Note that his proposal would ban any major or minor in women and gender studies, or any ideas or modes of instruction or knowledge production that calls into question the guiding assumption that freedom is the unique province of the West. And I think it's also not coincidental, it's not unimportant that Reagan is attacking Angela Davis and DeSantis is focused in, as well as Mark Ruffo, have focused in on those ideas that have been developed by Black radical women. Kimberly Crenshaw, critical race theory, not just, but pioneered, intersectionality, et cetera. And so you see the same thing going on. And just for point of emphasis, the Board of Regents didn't fire an administrator at University of California, Irvine, who was brought up in the same meeting in the summer of 1970, where they fired Angela Davis. And this person had been a member of the Students for Democratic Society, was considered a radical, and the president of UC Irvine wanted him fired, but he wasn't. And just so happens, totally accidental, that he was white, right? It's also not important that in 1983, Reagan sent in troops to invade and occupy Grenada under the premise that it was a destabilized government and that it threatened the region. And so you see in these actions, both forecasting a bit of Ron DeSantis, but also echoing, particularly in Grenada, Thomas Jefferson's sense of the US as an empire of liberty. This is Jefferson, quote, "We shall add to the empire of liberty an extensive and fertile country, thereby converting dangerous enemies into valuable friends." And this idea of the United States as this beacon of democracy that, as Wilson put it, must go into World War I to defend, to make the world safe for democracy. And one Black veteran who you can find this quote in Chad Williams's work, Torchbearers of Democracy, makes this really pithy point. We fought to make the world safe for democracy. Now we seek to make democracy safe for Negroes. And I think this captures an element in Black political thought that has a longstanding analysis of the link between Western practices of democracy and fascism. Consider the 1927 statement by Richard B. Moore, a Barbadian radical who was a member of the African Brotherhood and one of the earliest Black communists in the world. And this is in Brussels at the International Congress Against Colonial Oppression and Imperialism, where he insists that, quote, "The fight against imperialism is first of all an incessant struggle against imperialistic ideology, which includes, quote, fascism, the Ku Klux Klan, chauvinism, and the doctrine of the supremacy of the white race." Put differently, as Cedric Robinson argues, Black political thought has long broken, sorry, I'm just trying to keep track of time, has long broken with Western historiography's attempt to render fascism a, quote, negation of the Western Geist, to insist instead on fascism as a logic of the West, much like working class Black protests to the 1935 Italian invasion of Ethiopia, both in the US, the Caribbean, South Africa. You had people like Padmore who would put the point that Italy was part of a long history of European exploitation of African peoples and lands, and of, quote, white nations joining hands and assigning parts of Africa to whichever one stands most in need of colonies. And he's referencing here the 1885 Berlin Conference, where Europe carved up Africa for various European powers. Or take C.L.R. James's 1947 statement that, quote, "Only a shallow empiricism can fail to see that such monstrous societies as Stalinist Russia and fascist Germany are not the product of a national peculiarity or system, i.e. Germany or communist Russia, but a part and parcel of our civilization. In assessing the degeneration and decay of Western civilization, I do not separate East from West, fascism from democracy." Now, I want to play, and I understand I'm moving really quickly, but I want to play this clip from a film called Camp de Thiawar. This is by a Senegalese filmmaker named Osman Sembène. He has a really good catalog, but this is a very compelling movie about the decommissioning of French West African troops following World War II. And there is a exchange between the character on the left, Sergeant Giatta, and a figure of white liberal French enlightenment. And this is where Giatta is talking about a massacre in his home village, Ifak, and how he draws a connection between the French and the Nazis. Hopefully this will work without much trouble.
Ça va.
Pourquoi ils vous ont fait ça, là?
Oh, sorry. Oh, okay. At any rate, we'll just move on. So Giata is, if you can do it while I'm talking, probably. Yeah. Yeah. That one.
Quoi ça?
Votre costume de tirailleur alors que vous allez être démobilisé d'ici quelques jours?
Parce que nous ne sommes pas des citoyens français, nous sommes des sujets français.
Et pourquoi vous n'avez pas pris la nationalité française? Vous êtes instruit, non?
La nationalité française. Non merci. Je reste africain et je garde mon instruction.
Vous avez toujours l'intention de poursuivre vos études en France?
Oui, dès ma libération, j'irai à Efok, mon village, visiter les ruines. Je comptais justement vous y inviter. Hélas,
Les ruines de votre village?
vous n'êtes pas au courant?
Non.
Les soldats se sont rendus à Efok, mon village, pour réquisitionner le riz. Les femmes s'y sont opposées et notre vaillante armée de planquer à l'arrière a tiré sur une population sans défense. Efok a été rasé. Mon père et ma mère s'y trouvaient.
C'est horrible. Ça s'est passé quand?
Il y a 2 ans.
Toutes mes condoléances, Aloïse. Vous avez nommé votre fille du nom de votre mère, Bissom, c'est cela?
Oui.
1942, c'était encore les vichistes. Les temps changent, les mentalités également. Vous avez suivi la conférence de Brazzaville?
Et il me sera difficile d'oublier. Voyez-vous, je fais un parallèle entre Efok et Oradour-sur-Glane.
Ah, vous ne pouvez pas faire une telle comparaison. On ne peut pas comparer la barbarie nazie aux exactions de l'armée française. Non, c'est pas possible.
C'est l'armée coloniale. Même mentalité. Les officiers qui en 40 ont refusé le ralliement des forces de l'AOF aux forces françaises libres et qui ont fusillé des Sénégalais ralliés à ces forces sont les mêmes officiers qui sont à présent aux côtés du chef de la France libre et contrôlent les colonies.
Ne vous emportez pas. Vous connaissez bien le peuple de France. Vous savez que ça n'est pas pareil.
You can't compare Nazi barbarism with the excesses of our army. Now, in this, I think Sembène is really citing Aimé Césaire's point in Discourse on Colonialism, that the real problem that the West had with Hitler is not the crime against man as such, but that Hitler had unleashed on Europeans, on Europe, on white men, the crimes that had been enacted against Middle Easterns, Indians, and Africans. And he uses language that I won't use out of respect for everyone. But to bring this back around to Angela Davis and DeSantis and how I want to look at this history of Black anti-fascism in the current period. When the Unite the Right rally happened in Charlottesville and Heather Hoyer was killed, in the middle of the night that weekend, the university president at the University of Texas at Austin moved to have Confederate statuary removed from the quad, something that students have been asking for a while. And it wasn't like Black people hadn't been killed or threatened for a while and making these demands. But I think Césaire's point and the point that Giata is getting at is well taken here. And I think DeSantis reflects a response not too different from that. And that is a response not merely to uprisings of BLM from at least 2012 or 2014 to 2020 and the global currency of that, but also the currency and popularity of calls to defund and abolish the police following the murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis. And I think this is what we're looking at in the same way that Reagan was seeking to substantiate a particular social order. We see that today, and it's gaining currency. So whether or not DeSantis wins is less of an issue, just like it's less of an issue if Trump wins. It's more so, how do we then respond to the normal workings of the United States and understanding this as part of a longer history that gives fascism its currency and its livelihood and its persistence to come back in various forms.
Okay, I'd like to open it up to our panelists to ask each other questions or comment on their presentations for a few minutes before we open up the questions from the audience. Is Anna on screen behind me?
Should I be on the screen?
Sure, yeah.
Okay, hello everyone.
Is she on screen now?
Am
Okay.
I? It's funny, y'all are frozen on my end, but I can hear you just fine.
Good. Okay, so I'm just going to open it up to see if anyone wants to start a conversation between the panelists about and draw any connections or ask any questions.
Hi, Anna, it's Joe. So I'm really thinking mostly then maybe you could answer this, and then maybe Minka, you could respond to her answer. So to me, one of the things that Minka's speech pursued, and that is just so intrinsic to the Hands Off Ethiopia movement of 1935, is that imperialism and fascism can't get away from each other. And so I'm wondering, you were talking about these kind of like comparisons between the Klan and the Italian fascisti being made in the Black press. I'm wondering, like, is it only when you get to the Hands Off Ethiopia movement that people are saying that imperialism can't be understood as just simply empire anymore, but that this is fascist aggression, or did people already figure that out before 1935?
I guess in simplest terms, my hunch is that it predates it, right? And that there's a murmuring and there's an analysis that predates this sort of grassroots global movement, which then also gives the movement a sort of additional heft. I mean, the first again, I feel like I've sort of taken up the role here tonight of occupying the archival headlines. And one of the things that's so key is that for the Black press in the United States, for instance, in the lead up to the Italian invasion of Ethiopia, the first connection that they're making is the US invasion and occupation of Haiti, right, which ran from 1915 to 1934, and was actively covered in the Black press for the duration. And right, it's the other free Black nation on Earth at that time, and so the connection is glaring. Even like the images of it are similar. And you can just see, right, all of these like threads and connections being made in the press. But I know that this was also, I mean, I think Césaire's characterization of fascism as sort of the ravages of empire carried out on the European continent, right, is one of the most sort of robust and clear-eyed and full-throated expressions of that. But I know Padmore was writing about that too, sort of in the early 1930s, and notably, right, Padmore was working for the Communist International in Hamburg when the Nazis came to power and was deported by the Nazi government, right? So I mean, so I think both of you really spoke. I think that these global connections are so key, but I just have been struck in my research by how quickly the kind of racial imperial connection is so so clear from the beginning. And of course, I think hands off Ethiopia is a big tipping point. I think also once the Nazi government starts to expand and annex neighboring countries, and certainly with the onset of the war, the sort of arguments about, I mean, in the Black press, you also see a lot of invocation of the American settler colonial project across the continent and the dispossession and genocide of native populations as a point of comparison too. But I think the common, it all comes down to an argument of shared roots, right? I think across the kind of left liberal political perspective you see in the Black press, you don't always see the kind of full articulation of a fusion of an anti-imperial, anti-colonial, and anti-fascist struggle. But the analogy flows really readily. And it often, the shared argument, especially within this sort of common sense anti-fascist politics, is a sense of shared roots and a kind of, in Black public discourse, a kind of obviousness that Mussolini and the regimes of Mussolini and Hitler are both learning from European and American racial colonial precedents. And then also what I think is really striking is the Black press sort of really actively observes that it does seem that the Nazi regime is drawing on American jurisprudence. And I think what's really key is scholarship has taken up these arguments in the last 20 years, right? There was a big turn about 25 years ago in German history, sort of thinking about Hitler's imperial ambitions, but right, that Black journalists and thinkers are writing about this 100 years ago is really key.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, you're totally right. Of course, Haiti, and then I think of CLR James at the beginning of Black Jacobins. He says this is a book that one could only write in the age of fascism, and I understand how to write this. And also, you've written about how CLR James was active in protests in London against the invasion of Ethiopia, and I've always thought that there's something beautiful in that he had written wonderful works of history about his home country, Trinidad and Tobago, before he took part in this transnational movement. And then after he took part in this huge world-spanning protest movement with questions of empire and fascism, that's when he wrote this big splashing masterpiece. But I don't know if you want to.
Right. And I just will to wrap it up really quickly, right? It matters so much that in addition to sort of Black American writers, that some of the kind of forefathers of Black anti-fascist thought are British colonial subjects, right? Whether it's James, whether it's Padmore, whether it's Claudia Jones, right? So are already bringing a kind of anti-imperialist critique to anti-fascist analysis just from the very beginning.
Yeah, and I would just add to that there is, throughout the 19-teens, particularly after you have the US occupation of Haiti, and then a year later, the occupation of the Dominican Republic. And at this time, the Dominican Republic was clearly understood as a Black nation. And then you have World War I and Wilson's 14 points of why the US is entering the war and what the goals are, which become the foundation for the League of Nations. You have a Black radical press critiquing the arguments that are being made around questions of self-determination, that are being made around political independence, and that are being made around democracy, because the US is an imperial power at that time. So it's not just this domestic power that is trying to confront in fumbling ways racial oppression, but it's actively engaged in exporting these racial practices and logics throughout the Western Hemisphere. And there's this real clear sense that this is confined in terms of this buoyant democracy is confined to a European context. It doesn't apply to the Philippines. It doesn't apply to Haiti. It doesn't apply to the Dominican Republic. It doesn't apply to the US South. And I think what you see happen is that when you begin to get the rise of fascism and attention to that, and I think this is what Robinson is trying to get at. You can find, he has two real good essays. They overlap in many ways, but they're in the collection Cedric Robinson on racial capitalism and the Black intellectual tradition. But what you have is an attention that is persistent to the nature of racial oppression and colonialism throughout the world, that once you get the rise of fascism, people are pointing out that what we are seeing is almost identical to what has already been going on. And then a woman by the name of Zoe Samudzi has pointed this out in response, because I think there's a very good point to be made about Nazi Germany drawing legal rationale and juridical justification from the United States. But she points out that, which is a very obvious point that people apparently don't make that often, Germany does have the Herero genocide. It does have its own practices on the African continent. And ironically, at the same year that Discourse on Colonialism comes out, and Aimé Césaire's discussion of these practices being brought back on Europe, the French is Chaque un retour, but it's translated as the boomerang effect in 1955. Hannah Arendt makes a very similar argument about German colonial practices in Africa, bringing a racial logic back to Europe. Now, I think what the Black radical tradition would say, someone like Césaire would say, was that racial logic was already there in Germany. We see it in 1885. We see it, some would argue, from 1492, and that we have to really understand how it unfolds, how it develops, how it is nimble enough to navigate and respond to different kinds of situations. And this is where I think James's point about, we can't rely on a false empiricism, because then that allows us to separate what happens in the British Empire, in the French Empire, in the Belgian territories in Africa, in Angola, Mozambique, Guinea-Bissau, Cape Verde, from what happens in Italy, what happens in Spain, what happens in Germany. And it's not unimportant, and I'd be interested to get your thoughts on this, that in 1937, you have Black people around the world, they hold a World Congress Against Racism and White Supremacy that is very little talked about. I think I just mentioned it, but I have found very little that's written about this. But this is at the same time that Black working class people and Black activists are going to fight in Spain in the Abraham Lincoln Brigade, because as Robin Kelly points out, they weren't able to go and fight in Ethiopia. His article, "This is Ethiopia, but it'll do." There's just been this long tradition of trying to insist and expose the limits and the hypocrisy of Western democracy, of Enlightenment ideals that have consistently and explicitly been premised, and this is actually an empirical point, they have been premised and built upon forms of freedom, forms of democratic practice, forms of political association that are supported and stands on the back and blood of people who are colonized in Africa, Asia, and exterminated and colonized in the Americas. And so I think that's what really is potentially easily overlooked, which isn't to negate how unique a flashpoint the Third Reich might have been, or Mussolini might have been, but it's not to see this as an aberration, but that this is a development out of series of practices that we can actually identify and are longstanding.
Yes, I'll just briefly, that was basically Benito Mussolini's response was, all these protests saying, this is, fascism, see, it's a global menace. It's coming after all of us. It's Ethiopia today, you tomorrow. It's basically his response was, what are you talking about? This is no different than what Europe has been doing. This isn't the fascist project. This is just statecraft. This is just Europe needing to have, he didn't use the language, but he meant, living space. That's what he was doing. He was just, being a European empire.
Yeah, just because of time, I'd like to open it up now to audience questions. Because we have people watching, attending remotely, I would like to give you the mic to ask your question so that they can hear your question. We don't have to repeat it. So if you have a question, you can raise your hand and I'll bring the mic to you. Any other questions?
This might be a kind of a dumb question. I kind of showed up late, so I apologize for that. But I do just want to know, like, with the war in Tigray, I wonder what if like the Hands Off Ethiopia movement had any influence on like the war in Tigray and spreading in misinformation or in foreign involvement in that to an extent.
Would anyone like to take that? Anna or other panelists?
I'll just say I don't know, but I mean the language of hands off Ethiopia, that's stuck. That's still there. Like you see that that phrase, it still didn't disappear, and so people still talk about it with Tigray. They say hands off Ethiopia.
Yeah, but also just say that, and Majid Mengiste has two really good novels about Ethiopia, both around 1970, but with the Italian occupation. And so in that, you see kind of a novelistic presentation of criticisms of the Ethiopian crown. Those criticisms were part of the Black radical discourse at the time. And so it was a sense that there were serious problems with Selassie's rule and the nature of, we might say caste or racial difference within Ethiopia itself that both mapped on to distinction between what is now Eritrea, or I don't know if that extends back that far, but so there were criticisms at the time of the nature of Ethiopian society and politics, but that they refused to let that influence or tamp down their criticism of Italy. Whether that carries forward, honestly, I wouldn't know either, I have to say.
Okay, so we have one here. Other questions there? So I can start a queue. Okay.
I had a question about how you would consider fascism in the United States, given that fascism obviously affects different groups of people differently. Couldn't you maintain that the United States has always been a fascist state for the indigenous, Black, and otherwise marginalized people? And couldn't you make parallels between the idea of living space and the ideas of manifest destiny in the Louisiana Purchase? And I wonder what you would say in relation to that about race as a colonial construct.
If I understood the first part of your question, you were asking about fascism and kind of the longstanding experiences of indigenous and Black people, or did I misunderstand that part of the question? That's it? Yeah, so I think, well, part of what I might say as myself, not just looking at what has been said by Black radical thinkers, is that we should be careful to talk about fascism as such existing transhistorically, because at the point when we say that this experience is a fascist experience writ large, we kind of lose an analytical precision and ability to kind of highlight what exactly we're talking about at different times. I think in terms of the arguments that were being made, it isn't so much that there's fascism writ large, at least the point that I'm trying to draw out. It's more so that what we think about as Western democracy and freedom, the things that fascism are seen to be a detour from, a break from, or a rupture from, so that Germany isn't seen as a product of democratic practice. It's seen as an aberration or a break from that. I think there's a point to be made there, but at the same time, we have to deal with what are the actual practices, mechanisms, and rationales at given historical points in time that help us understand, say, the extermination of indigenous peoples, the enslavement of African peoples, the indentureship of Asians coming in the late in late 19th century to both the US and the Caribbean, right? That isn't to say that how people are responding to Ethiopia and then the kinds of arguments that gives us and the kinds of ways that they're trying to understand what's happening in the 1930s and 40s, and then how the US has existed, how the West has existed, so Britain and France, et cetera, isn't important. But I do think that there has to be, in terms of how we look back at it now, we do have to have that precision at the same time that we're talking about how people are refusing a clear moral, ethical, political distinction between fascism as an ideology and Enlightenment. Because at that point, then if you ally that, then I think you're getting to your very point that how do you understand freedom? How do you understand Enlightenment ideals in the context in which they emerge, which is colonialism? And in that sense, I think there's a way to understand race as a colonial logic, but there are also ways that we might think about, and this is where I'm drawing on Cedric Robinson explicitly, what we understand as race and how it functions. Depending on how we understand that, we can see that as something that's an issue of a much longer process than just the period of colonialism that we are thinking about. So that 1492 might be a breaking point and give us a distinct form, but that it may not necessarily be the simple explanatory moment of race then is a product of imperialist or capitalist actions, that it actually is something that's much more endemic to the structures of Western thought.
And Anna, I can't see you, so you'll have to just speak up.
Yeah, I can say something on that too, because I do find, right, in sort of opening up the archives of this world of I mean, I struggle sometimes narratively to describe the kind of newspapers I was sharing at the outset, because sometimes the writer is working in pure analogy, right? Sometimes they do just want to draw a connection as a means of provoking the federal government to understand what they're going through, right? The argument of so many Black Americans during the 30s and 40s was, well, why does our country feel the need to mobilize a large-scale total war against this enemy abroad when what the enemy abroad is doing looks a lot like what they're doing to us back home, right? So sometimes it's this moment of there is an analogy involved, but then what I become really interested in is when you start to draw the direct lines, right? And I feel like in my work, I'm interested in mapping those direct connections, mapping like actual human encounters, seeing how many clicks away you can get between a comparison and an actual something a little bit messier. I think I hesitate though when I open it up, because I do sometimes find people say, well, could we say this is fascist? Could we say this is fascist? And I think an anxiety about that slippery slope is what drives a lot of people to want to just not engage in this conversation at all. And as a historian, right, I think I was initially struck by just the saturation of this language in the archives, and what I think is the rise, sort of global domination and sort of military collapse of fascism that happens in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, but mostly between 33 and 43. That opens up in Black anti-fascist discourse a new way to talk about exactly what Minka was saying, right? That to challenge the idea that fascism is some monstrous other, right? To challenge the idea that fascism is a break, is an aberration, is some kind of exceptional nightmare scenario, but rather, right, is more like a doppelganger, right? Or is more like a kind of odd bedfellow to democracy, right? Which often in the context of the United States then served to argue against the reality that there was a democracy in the United States at all. So I think, right, if we're to understand, right, the act in this moment, I think it often comes down to the 30s and 40s opening up a moment in the United States led by Black radical thinkers, but also everyday people, to really challenge the demarcation line between fascism and democracy. And this is an argument I'm learning from Cedric Robinson as well as Paul Gilroy, but to just develop a kind of vigilance about the instability and porousness between so-called liberal democracy and so-called fascism, right? And Paul Gilroy says, right, especially what happens after 1945, when, right, there's no fascist regimes anymore, right? Is there's an impulse in the Black radical tradition to adopt a vigilance about where one form of violent politics begins and the other ends, essentially before it's too late.
Okay, thank you. We'll take this question and it'll be our last.
What happens to the Hands Off Ethiopia movement, especially in the United States, and especially in the context of the Second World War? Do these activists fold neatly into supporting the Allied war effort? That's what I'm interested in. I would like to know how what are the contours of that support, especially with the previous pre-war considerations and connections between fascist states and liberal democracies. How comfortably do these activists then, a decade later, fall into? Do they join the armies? Do they support this war effort?
Anyone want to volunteer to start that one? Joe.
Yeah, I mean, so a lot of them do, but a lot of them are also dead. A lot of them already died in Spain. But I think it ties to, this is, I think, one of the great anti-fascist feats, is to challenge places like the United States to draw that line sharply between themselves and fascism. You know, everybody, like during the Cold War, everybody talks about like Cold War civil rights and how like the United States had to draw a sharp contrast between itself and the Soviet Union. And so that created space for civil rights actors. But like that dynamic started already with World War II, with trying to draw that sharp contrast between the Allies and the fascist powers. And so, you know, I mean, you see this in the moment, like the American right, you know, FDR saying like, we are fighting for democracy against fascism. And this is like the origins of the right saying like, oh, we're not a democracy. Don't call the United States a democracy. It's wrong to call the United States a democracy. They don't like that maneuver, but that talk comes out of this moment because the United States is pushed to make itself the antithesis to fascism, like you said, to like create, this is like the invention of that way of thinking of fascism as this great outlier, this thing that isn't part of the broader history of modernity. And so I think they push the United States to make that, and people are interested in that. And so people are interested, and then they're interested in pushing that forward, even in the post-war. One of the things that I've read Anna's dissertation, one of the things that amazes me about it is that she makes clear that Robert F. Williams, who's a civil rights worker in North Carolina, he's most prominent in the late 50s into the 60s, that he was very serious, sincere anti-fascist. And that he got that in this earlier moment. And he was a soldier in the US Army during World War II. And he took seriously this rhetoric of the United States as an anti-fascist army. And they were interested in making the United States live up to that standard. So I think they were interested in pursuing what you're talking about, and they were interested in making it happen. They knew that it's not like they said, oh, well, there's that poster that says the United States is anti-fascist, and so I will go enlist. But no, that they're like, this is a moment of possibility, and I'm going to seize that.
You know, just add that one of the things that is unique about the post-World War II moment is that you have a decided shift in Black public discourse away from kind of, you know, to use Du Bois's closed ranks, 1919 or whenever it was, around World War I, you know, let's serve and demonstrate our fitness to the nation. But there's a much more decided critique of the US state that issues out of that. Now it takes various different forms, but when you look at what people are saying that we're talking about in the 30s and then the 40s, And then you look at the language that you get in the civil rights movement. So, you know, it's people are understanding that they're arguing for rights of citizenship, et cetera, but they're calling for freedom, let freedom ring, freedom now, so forth and so on. And then this then gives way to Black power, which is this much more fundamental challenge to the very structures of the society, how it is both economically, socially, politically structured. And this, I think, is what Angela Davis is kind of distilling in that notion that we have to talk about the structures of the society. When we talk about academic freedom, how do we change the way that we train people to think and be good human beings? So I think it's a number of ways that it plays out. And then, you know, again, there's always this back and forth. So what is the response in terms of not merely the Cold War, but McCarthyism and the disciplining and exacting price from so many Black radicals in particular. Not only CLR Jane, well, that's before, no, it's after 55, Claudia Jones, then Paul Robeson, W.B. Du Bois, and then you have these much more, you know, you can look at really the 1960s up to now as this kind of pushback against that radical current that begins with the Hands Off Ethiopia and with World War II. Because I think part of what happens in this period is that by and large people, the Black public sphere rejects the idea that we're going to demonstrate our way into freedom and into equality. And so they have to be much more strident demands. Again, Chad Williams, his work kind of focuses on World War I, but I think he's the person, at least that I know of, who would probably best be suited to talk about what that looks like and how that plays out in the series of wars and conflicts that Black people get drawn into and drafted into following World War II, excuse me.
Anna, would you like the last word since Joe cited your dissertation?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just to say, you know, I think that there's been so much wonderful scholarship in recent years that have argued that we really need to look to the 30s and 40s to understand the full arc of the civil rights movement. And I think we're describing this sort of broad grassroots movement. Hands Off Ethiopia was a sort of sprawling thing that united all of these different individual organizations that in their sort of other iterations were working on civil rights, labor rights issues, you know, housing reform, all sorts of things. But there's a lot of complexity and heterogeneity within that. So I think for many people, for many Black Americans, you know, the very nature that the United States was fighting against the fascists opened up space for there to be a kind of mainstream resonance of what was otherwise a kind of radical anti-fascist tradition. And I think as my co-presenters described, the suddenness with which that is shut down in 45, I think is so key and so radicalizing for a few who could survive the ravages of the Red Scare, right? But that the Double V campaign, which was such a motivator for Black Americans, right? The idea that we're fighting for democracy abroad and at home, though some pushed it further and sort of shifted, it said, no, we're fighting against fascism abroad and at home, right? That has such reach during the war that the question becomes in 1945, well, we beat the fascists abroad, so what's happening back here? But I will also say there were radical anti-fascist pacifists who refused to fight in a Jim Crow army. And among them was Bayard Rustin, right, who is the architect of the civil rights movement and the March on Washington, right? So there was complexity, and I think where there's just a richness in this early era that I encourage you all to dig into further.
Just very briefly, what Anna said made me think. So one of the things that comes out of this conversation is just how much some of the great Black scholarship of the last decades has come from people who are thinking seriously about the Hands Off Ethiopia moment. And I mean, just scholar after scholar, and you mentioned Robin Kelly's It Ain't Ethiopia, But It'll Do, explaining why Black Americans would go fight in Spain. And I would just add that Robin Kelly's among the scholars that Florida axed from the Black Studies AP curriculum. And you don't have to think that DeSantis is a fascist to recognize that this anti-fascist tradition of thought is inconvenient for him, and it's a problem for people like them, and they're trying to, erase it.
Thank you. And with that, I want to thank our panelists. I want to thank our audience, both remote and in person. Shout out to Ashley Lawrence Sanders, who's been a part of past events and is with us here today. Thank you to Julie. Thanks to the tech people for making this happen. Please stick around and ask questions if you have time. So thank you very much and have a good evening.
Moderating.